The room has no windows. The windows exist, but they have been sealed. Black velvet covers every wall, every pane, every surface that might admit daylight into what was once a child's bedroom. Candles have been burning here without interruption for months. They burn in the morning. They burn at midnight. They will continue burning until someone with the authority to stop them gives the order, and no one has done that yet. At the center of the room, a small bed. In the bed, a girl of 7 years lies on her back, eyes open. Above the headboard, suspended from the ceiling by a chain of gilded iron, hangs a casket no larger than a jeweler's box. Heavy, cast from gold, sealed shut. Inside the casket, a human heart. The girl has been told it belonged to her father, the greatest king Sweden had ever produced, the man who reformed European warfare, the man who held the Protestant North together by the force of his cavalry and his will. She has been told she should feel honored to sleep beneath it, close to him, connected. She lies there every night. She does not sleep. This is not a story about grief. Every queen who ever lived has lost a husband to war. Many did not recover. History has generally treated them with patience. Mourning queens are sympathetic, and the 17th century offered no shortage of them. This is the story of what grief becomes when it is not contained, when it expands past the body that holds it. This is the story of how one woman's love for a dead man was converted into a sentence served by the child she never truly wanted, and how that child would spend 40 years running from the shadow of a golden casket that had once hung above her in the dark. Before we descend into the sealed chambers of Stockholm's royal palace and trace what grief did to the people inside them, drop a comment below with your city and country. We want to know where in the world Velours' Spectre is reaching. Hit subscribe and join the channel Premium Dark History every week. You are watching Velours' Spectre. The Swedish Empire of the early 17th century was not a nation. It was a machine, and between 1611 and 1632, that machine had been running at a pace the rest of Europe could not match. Under Gustavus Adolphus, Sweden had absorbed Livonia, Estonia, Ingria, and a chain of Baltic ports that gave Stockholm effective control of northern European trade. The army he built was the most technically sophisticated military apparatus the continent had seen in a generation: combined arms infantry, mobile field artillery, cavalry that moved faster than any opposing commander could adjust to. By 1630, Swedish forces had entered the Holy Roman Empire and changed the trajectory of the 30 Years' War almost immediately. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg arrived at this court in 1620, 20 years old, and newly married to the king. She was the daughter of Elector Johann Sigismund, a respectable Protestant lineage and a useful diplomatic link for Sweden's ambitions in the northern German states. By every surviving account, she was considered striking, tall, fair-haired, possessed of an emotional intensity that the Stockholm court would spend years trying to categorize. Veronica Buckley, in her biography of Christina published in 2004, describes Maria Eleonora as a woman who experienced feeling at an amplitude the people around her found difficult to absorb. She loved Gustavus Adolphus as a consuming fact of her existence. She followed his military campaigns beyond the reasonable reach of a queen consort. She built her entire operational identity around the fact of his survival. Every ambition, every fear, every definition of self anchored to one man. This was the infrastructure of her psychological world. Functional, even formidable, built entirely on a single load-bearing wall. She bore 3 children. 2 died in infancy. The daughter born in 1626, she reportedly received with disappointment. She had wanted a son for 6 years of marriage. What she had instead was a girl. She did not hide her disappointment. Maria Eleonora of Brandenburg was 32 years old when her world ended, which is to say, when her husband did. She was, by the physical descriptions that survive her, a woman who occupied space with particular force. Pale in the northern European manner that the Swedish court recognized and prized. She dressed in the fashion of the Brandenburg court rather than adopting Swedish convention, a distinction that ambassadors passing through Stockholm noticed and recorded. She was not warm. She was not soft. She was not what 17th-century Lutheran Sweden would have selected for its queen had the selection been theirs to make. But she was Gustav Vasa's, and he had wanted her, and that was sufficient. She bore his absence badly during every campaign. The letters she wrote to him, many of which survive in the Riksarkivet, the Swedish National Archives, track the arc of her attachment over 12 years of marriage. The early letters are declarations. The later ones approach a kind of structured panic. He was the center of gravity around which her entire psychological life orbited. She had arranged herself around him so completely that no independent architecture remained. She did not know how to exist outside of that orbit. In 1626, after 6 years without a surviving heir, she delivered a daughter. The birth was difficult. The infant lived. Maria Eleonora wept, not from relief. She had wanted a son. What she had was a girl she named Christina, a girl she would later describe in private correspondence as a disappointment from the first day. She would not understand for many years what she had actually produced. Maria Eleonora received the news on the 6th of November 1632. It arrived the way catastrophic information always moves through royal courts, through a chain of intermediaries, each carrying the same weight, each knowing what they held. The Battle of Lützen had been fought that morning in thick Saxon fog. Sweden had won. The enemy had been driven from the field. The Swedish army held the ground, but Gustavus Adolphus had not come back with it. He had ridden too far forward in the fog, separated from his bodyguard, and been shot in the back. His horse dragged him through the battle line before his men could reach him. A second shot ended it. He was 37 years old. His body was recovered, stripped. Soldiers who passed it in the confusion had not recognized him. When his identity was confirmed, the army's grief was of a kind that contemporary chroniclers struggled to describe. He had not merely been their commander. He had been the reason for the campaigns, for the frozen German winters, for the dying. Without him, the strategic logic of the Swedish intervention in the 30 Years' War had to be reconstructed from the ground up. A 6-year-old daughter held the throne in name. A regency council held it in practice. Maria Eleonora did not receive any of this as strategic information. She collapsed. Attendants were summoned. Physicians maintained a constant presence in her chambers for days. She was not grieving in a way that moved toward resolution. She was falling into it vertically, without traction, without a floor to reach. She refused to let the body go. That refusal was where the story truly begins, not in the fog at Lützen, not in the second shot. Here, in the moment, a widow decided that possession was the only response to loss she could comprehend. Maria Eleonora kept the body of Gustavus Adolphus above ground for 18 months. The corpse was embalmed and placed in an open coffin at the royal palace, a standard protocol for monarchs awaiting state burial. But not for this duration, not for a year and a half. The preservation process stabilized the exterior of the body. It did not stop what time did to the rest of it. Maria Eleonora spent those months in the chamber. She stroked the clothing. She sat beside the coffin through the night. She spoke to it. She refused to leave it unattended. The council watched this with the particular discomfort of men who had administrative authority over a nation, but no protocol for a grieving queen who would not release her husband's corpse. They attempted, on multiple occasions, to initiate burial proceedings. She refused. When they approached the coffin to begin preparation, she intervened physically. The accounts that survive, preserved in correspondence from the period, describe council members being forced to remove her hands from the king's clothing. Picture this scene. A woman in her early 30s, surrounded by men who governed the most powerful Protestant state in Europe, gripping a dead man's sleeve and refusing to let go. Not because she had failed to understand that he was dead. She understood. She simply could not process the transition from possession to memory. Possession had been the entire system. Memory offered her nothing it could replace. The council's position was a standoff. They had legal authority. They lacked the political will to physically remove a grieving queen from her husband's body in view of court witnesses. So the body remained. For 18 months the candles burned. The palace carried a smell that no account from the period names directly. When they finally compelled burial in January of 1634, 14 months after Lutzen, Maria Eleonora was not present at the Riddarholmen church ceremony. She was elsewhere. She was arranging what she intended to keep. Maria Eleonora's terms for accepting the burial were not openly negotiated. There was no legal framework in Swedish court protocol for what she wanted. No precedent, no category. She wanted the heart. Before the body of Gustavus Adolphus was sealed into the royal vault at Riddarholmen Church in January of 1634, his heart was removed, separately embalmed, and placed inside a golden casket that Maria Eleonora had commissioned. The preservation of royal body parts carried centuries of Catholic precedent across Europe. The heart of Louis X, the heart of Richard I, the hearts of Habsburg emperors distributed across Vienna and Krakow and Graz. But Sweden was Lutheran. It had spent a generation purging exactly this kind of relic veneration from its religious practice. Maria Eleonora was not engaged in theology. She was engaged in keeping. What happened next is documented in an extraordinary source, Christina of Sweden's own autobiography, composed in her own hand in 1681, nearly 50 years after these events, with a directness that does not soften what occurred. Maria Eleonora brought the casket to her daughter's bedroom. Christina was 7 years old. The casket was hung above the child's bed from a chain of gilded iron. The room was sealed, every wall draped in black cloth, every window covered, every reflective surface removed. Candles were installed in continuous rotation, burning day and night. No daylight entered that bedroom for what Christina herself would later estimate as more than a full year. The child was told this was love, that sleeping beneath her father's heart was an honor, that proximity to his remains was the nearest thing to his continued presence she would ever have. Within months, the court physicians were recording a painful sore on Christina's chest that did not resolve. She was sleeping badly. Her appetite had become unreliable. The child who would eventually become one of the most intellectually formidable rulers of her century, who would correspond with Descartes, speak 7 languages before she was 22, and cause half of Europe to revise its assumptions about what a woman could be, was at age 7, being systematically unmade inside a black room. According to Susanna Ackermann's 1991 study of Christina's intellectual formation, the Regency Council's concern for the child queen was genuine, but subordinate to a different calculation. They were sent to Wasson Riveman 4.7 assessing whether the Queen Mother's behavior was becoming a liability to the Regency's political credibility. They were running the ledger. The numbers resolved in 1636. 4 years after Lutzen, 2 years after the burial, the Swedish council moved formally to strip Maria Eleonora of her parental rights over Christina. She was transferred to Gripsholm Castle, 62 miles west of Stockholm, under what the official documentation described as supervised residence. She was 37 years old. They did not return the casket. It did not matter. What had been done to the child in the black room was already complete. You cannot reverse a year of darkness, of candle smoke, of sleeping beneath a dead man's heart on the instruction of the person whose job it was to protect you. The damage had been entered into the record. The psychological ledger, once opened, does not close simply because the accounting stops. Christina was 10 years old when her mother was sent away. She did not cry. Maria Eleonora at Gripsholm did not accept exile as a permanent condition. She was housed in the castle under the management of attendants, whose primary function was containment. The correspondent, she generated letters preserved in fragments in the Riksarkivet documents, a woman who had transitioned from grief into something harder, the cold recognition that she had been decommissioned. She had been queen consort of the most dominant Protestant monarchy in Europe. She was now a supervised liability in a stone castle 62 miles from power. Her access to her daughter formally revoked, her communications screened. She petitioned the council continuously. She demanded visits with Christina. She argued that the separation had no legal foundation, that no Swedish court possessed the jurisdiction to remove a living parent from a living child on the grounds of grief alone. The council replied in language that was formally polite and substantively empty. The administrative machinery had processed her. The case was considered closed. For 4 years this structure held. Then, in the autumn of 1640, Maria Eleonora did something no one in the Swedish court had anticipated. She escaped. She was 40 years old. She was under supervised residence inside a fortified castle. She had identified one viable route. She descended from it at night, with the assistance of one lady-in-waiting, who had remained loyal through 4 years at Gripsholm, reached the Baltic coast, and boarded a Danish warship. Stand inside that moment with her for a second. A 40-year-old former Queen of Sweden, descending from a tower window in the dark, stepping onto the ship of an enemy nation. Sweden and Denmark were not at peace in 1640, knowing that every Protestant court in Europe, knowing her daughter now 13 years old, and a queen in her own name, would be told and would have no legal authority to help her even if she chose to. Knowing this act made her, in the diplomatic language of the century, an instrument of the wrong side. She climbed anyway. She had no plan beyond escape. The Danish court received her with the particular wariness that displaced royals generate, symbolically useful as an embarrassment to Sweden, uncomfortable as a permanent installation. Denmark drifted toward open conflict with Sweden in 1643, the Torstenson War, which would run for 3 years. Maria Eleonora had fled one political entanglement and arrived directly inside another, belonging to neither. She spent 8 years in this condition. Copenhagen, then Brandenburg, then the Habsburg territories, an exile moving through courts that received her with formal courtesy and genuine calculation. She wrote letters to a daughter who sometimes replied and sometimes did not. A relationship conducted entirely through intermediaries, thinning with each year that passed. Christina, meanwhile, was becoming something her mother had not accounted for. She was not warm. She was not governable by sentiment or obligation. She had become, in the years since the Black Room and the decades since Gripsholm, precisely what that sequence should have destroyed. Intellectually ferocious, emotionally self-contained, entirely self-directed. She had built her psychological infrastructure on no single load-bearing wall. She had constructed it from the inside out, from the materials that survived the room with the casket and the years that followed. She hosted the philosopher René Descartes at the Stockholm court in 1649, a man she had been corresponding with since her 17th year, summoned north to tutor her in the pre-dawn hours because Christina kept hours no other European court observed, rising at 5 in the Swedish dark for philosophy sessions before the palace had finished with the night. She had left the casket behind, not the memory of it. The memory was structural. But the golden box, the preserved heart, these no longer had a location in the life she had built. In 1648, the Peace of Westphalia ended 30 years of European war. Maria Eleonora was permitted to return to Sweden. She was 48 years old. She came back to a court her daughter now governed in fact as well as name, a court that received her with correct formality and genuine distance. The reunion was not warm. On the 6th of June 1654, Christina abdicated the throne of Sweden, not under compulsion, not from illness, coup, or defeat. She removed the crown herself at the ceremony in Uppsala and announced her intention to leave. She was converting to Catholicism. She was going to Rome. Maria Eleonora, 54 years old, watched a daughter she had sealed inside a black room choose the faith that her Protestant warrior husband had fought against and the city his campaigns had never reached. She had 1 year left. She spent it watching. Maria Eleonora died on the 18th of March 1655. She was 55 years old. She had outlived her husband by 23 years. 23 years spent entirely in the extended aftermath of one November morning at Lutzen. The council that had stripped her of her parental rights outlasted her. The palace she had sealed in black cloth still stood. The vault at Riddarholmen still held the body she had refused to release for 18 months. The golden casket's final documented location is not consistently recorded. Christina was in Rome. She had converted to Catholicism at Innsbruck in December of 1654. 3 months after her abdication, then proceeded to the papal city where she would live for the remaining 34 years of her life. Scholar, art patron, exile by choice. She corresponded with popes and philosophers. She never returned to Sweden. She had, in the end, performed a version of the same operation her mother had once attempted on her. She had walked away from everything she was expected to be and called it a form of freedom, a different kind, but recognizable. The Regency Council that had governed in her name became a footnote. The empire her father had built outlasted both of them. The room in Stockholm, the black room, the candles, the chain of gilded iron above the child's headboard was refurnished. Someone opened the windows. Hannah Arendt drew a distinction that Maria Eleonora's story makes visceral, between the violence that is recognized as violence and the violence that arrives wearing the language of love. Arendt's framework was political. The machinery of institutional harm, the way ordinary mechanisms can produce extraordinary cruelty without any single hand acknowledging what it is doing. But the mechanism operates in the private register with identical precision. Grief without limit will find a vessel. It cannot dissolve into nothing. It transfers. The lesson is not new. Tacitus, writing about the Roman imperial court and the corrosion of power across generations, observed that those who loved completely were also those most capable of destroying the people nearest to them when that love was interrupted. The container changes. The century changes. The mechanism does not. It appears in throne rooms and in bedrooms. It arrives in golden caskets and in silence. Visitors to Riddarholmen Church in Stockholm walk past the royal vault where Gustavus Adolphus has rested since 1634. The stone is cold. There is no marker on the outside indicating what was removed before it was sealed. No plaque records the transaction between a widow and the men who finally took the body from her. The heart was the only thing she kept. It was the only thing that cost her everything else. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story revealed something you did not expect about grief, about motherhood, about what devotion without limits can become when it runs out of the person it was built for, subscribe, hit the like button, and share it with someone who needs to see it. You have just watched another premium dark history documentary from Velours Spectre. Click the video appearing on your screen right now. The descent into the past continues.